It's great to get a chance to see these drivers away from the racetrack and look at the personal side without all the pressure that's on them at the racetrack. And no doubt, Alan Kawicki is a driver with a bright future to go along with his current success. Now, a man whose place in NASCAR history is well established is living legend Tim Flock. He was a two-time Grand National champion, which was what the circuit was called the days before Winston Cup. This true gentleman spent some time with us. He talked about his life, his career, and gave us a peek at his incredible personal collection of memorabilia. The NASCAR in the 50s, the man to watch out for was Tim Flock. He collected 40 victories and 37 poles, as well as 2 championships, one in '52 and the other in '55. We sat down with him in his own museum of memorabilia that his wife collected for him and heard some classic stories from the past. So when did you start driving a race car?
Benny, my first race was at North Wilkesboro back in 1948 in the modified cars. This was before Grand National racing started.
What do you mean a modified car? Now, you got to remember, I was born in 1941, so I don't know much about those cars.
Well, I got to take you back for the young audience watching us today, but back in Atlanta, back in the early 40s, there was about 15 or 20 bootleggers that hauled moonshine liquor out of Dahlonega, Georgia, the Georgia mountains back into Atlanta. And there were 39 Fords, 34, 35, 36, right on up 39 Fords. And they had red Volt engines in them, and they could take one of these cars up in the mountains and get 180 gallons a load of sugar on it and come back in Atlanta. And when they set it off, they collected more money than they could if they'd been working. Well, they always was arguing about who had the fastest bootleg car. Well, they got out about 15 miles from Atlanta and actually cut a place in a field, just an old acre field, and they would meet on Sundays, and this is a true story. They would run those cars against each other, and the bootleggers were making a lot of money. The kingpins that owned those cars would bet amongst each other who had the fastest car. Finally, a bunch of people heard about these races, and they started coming out and line up all the way around this fence, and the guys that was driving these cars would pass their hats, and people put quarters, $50 in there, and the bootleggers would split this, but the kingpins were betting like $5,000 on the cars. So that was actually the start of the modified racing that we run at North Wilkesboro and Greensboro and Greenville, South Carolina, Spartanburg in the early years. They were actually bootleg cars with them big souped up engines on them.
So when did you get your first really good car? What year?
In 1949, Buddy Elliott from Hickory, North Carolina, over here close to Hildebrand, he was at the very first race at Charlotte Motor Speedway, right here in Charlotte, in the first Grand National race, and him and Betty Elliott was sitting out against the fence behind the pits. And everybody else already had a car. I did not have a car for that very first race, and it's hard to believe that Bob says, there's a new Oldsmobile 88 sitting off that fence. Why don't you go over there to him and ask them people, would they let you drive that car next Sunday's race? This was 4 days before the race. I said, Bob, are you crazy? Come on, I'm going to go over there with you. And I walked over and I said, my name's Tim Flock, this is my brother Bob. And I said, they're going to have this race. And I said, you got an Olds 88 and you can't buy those things. I said, would you let me drive that car in next Sunday's race? And Betty, his wife, was sitting there, and she said, are you crazy? Just like what I told Bob. He said, let me take his car back, and I'll talk to Betty, and I'll be back here tomorrow. And Buddy showed up the next day without Betty, and we started putting some plates in the wheels. That's all you could do to the cars back then. And Buddy let me drive that car, that brand new Oldsmobile 88, in that very first race, and we finished 5th in it. And it was beat up from the front end, and the rocks kept knocking. We taped the front end real good, but it was beat up pretty bad. But he just let me drive it the rest of the year, and that was my first ride in the Grand National.
I mean, a man lets you drive a brand new car.
How about he hit 800 miles on it? But he was a race fan, and finally he was a real race car owner, you know.
He's about crazy, too. You know that, don't you?
Well, he had a lot of money. He had a hosier mill over in Hickory, building socks, you know, making socks. But he had a lot of money, and we run Lakewood. We won the Lakewood race in Atlanta with that car, and we run Langhorne, Pennsylvania. But he was enjoying the trips, and it got him away from home. And on the car, well, I kept telling him about Betty A a while ago, but on the car we had Nosy Rosie across the top of the windshield, because she was always after us, you know, about that car, and that was her car, and that was her grocery store car.
When did you ever drive the Hudson Hornet?
Yeah, when Betty and Buddy finally got out of racing, Ted Chester, a car dealer in Atlanta, he had a Hudson Hornet, and he had a bunch of car dealerships. He bought me my first Hudson Hornet in 1952, and we won the NASCAR National Championship, the point standings for 1952 in the Hudson Hornet.
For Ted Chester?
Ted Chester.
Those Hudsons, what did they have that was so exceptional back in the early 50s?
Benny, the Hudson Hornet, the reason that car won so many races, you know, didn't have very much horsepower, but it had a low center of gravity. When Hudson folded years later, Cadillac bought that design, but they called it a low center of gravity, step down design. You had to step down in the Hudson Hornet. The car had so much balance going through a turn. You could go in a turn with a Hudson Hornet on a half-mile track at 80 or 90 mile an hour, and you come off on the backstretch at 80 or 90 mile an hour. You'd take an Oldsmobile 88 or some other car and go in there at 80 mile an hour, you lose 15 mile an hour. And the Hudson it was just like running on a railroad track. It had real good balance, and it would keep the RPMs built up, just like when you're coming off a turn, try to let your car go over towards the wall to keep your RPMs built up. But it was a real good handling race car.
Now, I've heard about this monkey. Now, how did this all come about? You had a monkey that rode with you.
Yeah, we named him Jocko Flacco. Ted Cheshire, who owned my Hudson Hornet, came up to me one day at the car lot in Atlanta and said, "Tim, I've got a real cute African monkey. Would you let him ride in the race car with you?" I said, "Ted, have you lost your mind?" I said, "I don't believe NASCAR let us do that." But he said, "Would you let him ride?" I said, "Well, you own the car. I'll let him ride." But he said, "Well, first I'm going to get him a little cloth helmet built and a uniform, put Jocko on it, and put some decals on it," and which he did. A seamstress made 2 little uniforms for him. So we was worried about NASCAR catching this monkey in this car. We run full seats back then, like you got in your passenger car today. So a upholstery shop in Atlanta built a perch where Jocko had 2 nylon belts. He could look out the window of the car. So we parked the car in the infield and waited until they was just fixing to start. "Gentlemen, start your engine." We pulled in line, and NASCAR didn't know this monkey was in the car. And Benny, when they dropped that green flag, and I'm going down in the Hudson Hornet, which I was winning races in, when I'd pass a car, here's this driver looking over, and this monkey grinning at him. They'd almost run into the wall, really. Now, he run in 8 races with me, and we was running on a mile track in Raleigh on the 8th race. We had a board on a floorboard in our car with a chain. We could pull that board and had a light. We could see the right front tire, and when a white streak come in that tire, you had to come in and change it with about 2 laps.
Because you'd worn the tire into the cord.
Wore the tire down to the cord and give you 2 laps coming. But he had watched me pull that cord. He got out from under both belts and went down, and this is a true story, went down and a pebble hit him on the head, and he come and got on my back. Here I'm running at 85, 90 mile an hour, and leading the race. Funny was running second, and Speedy Thompson was third. So I come down pit road, and I real slow and easy, I hand him to a pit crew, and I caught second gear, but Funny come by and Speedy. That monkey cost me $750 difference. But stopping, which has never been done before, in NASCAR history, made a pit stop to put a monkey out of your race car.
Well, NASCAR must have known it after the second or third race.
They didn't say a word, but you can't do nothing like that no more. You know, when Earnhardt and Waltrip was getting booed 3 or 4 years ago, I told both of them, "Hey, all y'all got to do is get you a monkey, but you can't ride nothing in a race car no more." But I was the most popular guy you ever seen. Everybody in the grandstand had to come down to see Jocko.
See this monkey?
Yeah. I had to fire him after the 8th race. I could never teach him to sign his autograph.
Couldn't you? Tim, what's the most unusual thing that happened to you in a race car?
Benny, that had to be Daytona Beach, Florida in 1955. Have you ever been to Daytona and ride down the beach? There's millions of seagulls. And the speed limit uptown, you know, is 15 mile an hour. And some of these seagulls, they just walk in front of your car and they won't get out of the way. You can actually feed them loaf bread or popcorn out of your hand. But I had qualified, like I said earlier, 142 mile an hour, and I was on pole position on that beach road course, which was 4 miles around it. They started the race, Benny, on the backstretch back then. And you go through the south turn, and when I come out on the beach in second gear and popped it back in high, about halfway down that beach, here I'm running around 140, 39, 140 mile an hour, and these seagulls wasn't used to a car coming at them 139 mile an hour, and they wouldn't get out of the way, and they started hitting my windshield, and it sounded like popcorn hitting my windshield, and I looked in the mirror, and it looked like it was snowing behind me in Daytona Beach, Florida. I go all the way through the north turn, and then back down the backstretch, through the south turn, and the second lap, going down that beach, they wasn't a seagull nowhere in that county.
They got the message, didn't they?
They got the message. It's terrible that I had to do it, but there wasn't anything I could do running that fast, and all them cars behind me, though. I hated I killed all those seagulls.
What do you do about all the debris? I mean, when you hit the gulls, the feathers?
It taught us a lesson. We had a big old wire brush that we had a rope on where it wouldn't go out the window, and we'd reach out going through the south turn and scrape feathers off. In second gear, going up the back stretch, you had plenty of time, and scrape the feathers off, and then catch second and going back. And each lap, you'd scrape something off. We even tried 3 sheets of celluloid, you know, plastic, and have it fixed where you could pull off one after the first lap, second lap, and after the second lap, you didn't have to worry about it. They were gone.
Now, we're getting ahead of ourselves. I want to talk a little bit about your family.
Okay.
Now, there were 9 kids, is that what you told me?
Nine in my family.
You had 8 brothers and sisters.
Right.
And Bob and Fonnie
Bob
drove.
and Fonnie was NASCAR drivers. Fonnie won 22 Grand National races. Bob didn't run as much, but he did win the modified championship and 4 Grand National before he broke his neck in a Grand National race. My brother Carl raced boats. He won the Chicago World Fair in a boat, those kind you sit on your knees and drive with big motors on the back of them. My sister Ethel, she was named after the gasoline. My daddy named her Ethel. She was a race driver. She ran Daytona with us, Langhorne, Pennsylvania. She ran at Lakewood in Atlanta.
Really?
She ran with Louise Smith. You remember that name?
Yeah.
Sarah Christian. They called it the Powder Puff Derby back then. They had a bunch of lady drivers. The promoters were promoting races and tried to draw extra fans with women in the races, but some of them turned out to be real good drivers. And then my sister Rio was a parachute jumper. My dad started all this. He named her Rio after the first car that came to Alabama. It was a Rio car. But she made 32 parachute jumps when you had to cut the ripcord with a knife. Now, she was really the first daredevil in my family.
You jump out and cut the ripcord with a knife?
It didn't have the ripcord. Well, there wasn't no silk back then now when she was jumping, you know. The silk, they hadn't come in back then for parachutes. But they put newspaper up in the thing to make her bail her out when she jumped out from one of those old biplanes. But she was really the first daredevil in my family.
So you got it honest?
Yeah.
Man.
Flock of flocks.
The flock of flocks.
I'm just proud, Benny, of one thing before we go into something else. They 6 Hall of Fame awards in my family. Isn't that great?
How would you rate, would rate in today's drivers, who would you stack up against those guys back in the 40s and 50s? I mean, who would be able to compete back in the 40s and 50s? Earnhardt, Waltrip?
Well, you named 2 of them right there, be real good. I guess Elliott, there's several of them. But I still believe, and I hope, I work with these guys, and I see them in the pits all the time, but I believe that we had about 6 or 8 guys back then that would run rings around these guys today, because these guys don't know what I'm talking about. We were hungry. These guys are not hungry anymore. They're making $2 and $3 million a year, and they don't have to win. And a lot of these races are parades. I've been watching too. A lot of them parades. They sitting there back there waiting. You couldn't wait back then. We'd run these 30-lap shootouts or 50-lap shootouts. You had to drive your heart out.
Man, I just love sitting down and talking to these guys about NASCAR's earlier days. By the way, we're bringing you this edition of NASCAR Video Magazine from inside the National Motorsports Press Association Hall of Fame. Now, that's inside the Joe Weatherly Museum at Darlington International Raceway. Tim Flock, one great guy.